COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome to all of you. The C20 is an independent engagement group of the G20. It is a global platform for civil society organizations in the G20 process, delivering civil society's demand to world leaders. My name is Markus Engels, and I'm the Secretary General of the Global Solutions Initiative, an independent institution which supports the G20 and its engagement groups through research-based policy recommendation and a unique network composed of thought leaders from politics, research, civil society, and business. Today, we are going to discuss evidence versus politics, which is leading in the G20 process. You all know, although the G20 policy decision-making goes through a series of consensus-based negotiations with officials, bureaucrats, and experts within working groups, there are many political factors that come into play to influence the process of government's approaches to policy questions at the G20 table. This session will be a debate around the role of evidence in the global decision-making and how we can pave the way for more inclusive decision-making in the G20 process. We will start with a discussion between the distinguished experts on the panel for around 30 minutes before we open the floor to all of you, dear guests. Please send your questions and comments, and the panel will respond later. I am delighted to welcome the panelists. So we have Sanchita Pen. She's a non-profit fellow at Accountability Lab. She has been existing Accountability Labs engaging with the C20, mostly through research on the G20 anti-corruption commitment. Welcome to you. We have Ricardo Moro, Executive Chair of the Global Call for Action Against Poverty, one of the widest civil society networks on the world dealing with the Agenda 2030, with a special focus on poverty and inequalities. Ricardo is representing the Global Call for Action Italy that will host C20 next year in the C20 Steering Committee this year. He teaches development policies in the University of Milan in Italy. Welcome to you, Ricardo. And last but not least, we have Papazek. He's the Chief Statistic of UN Women. Welcome to you, Papa. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I would like to start with the first question to Papa, if you don't mind. Talking about the G20, is our panel title, Evidence versus Politics, more a statement or something you would put a question mark behind? So my question is, are the G20 more driven by tactical considerations or by data-based decision-making? Papa, what is your thinking on that?
Many thanks, Marcus, for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. Just to dive right into your question, I would say that in my experience, it isn't necessarily a binary where it is one or the other. And of course, you know, we have examples where data is completely disregarded, data and evidence are completely disregarded when decisions are made, or even worse, where data can be manipulated to make political decisions or to suit narratives. And without going into specifics, you know, some of the COVID-19 related decisions and actions that we've seen in recent months definitely fall in this category. But we also do have examples where data has been instrumental in shaping policy actions. And here I'll just give a few examples, and I think, you know, obviously these also extend to the G20 in the sense that, you know, in my experience, at least that's been the process. So an example is through UN Women Count Gender Data Program, we've recently supported violence against women surveys that immediately led to legislative changes on sexual harassment in Georgia and changes to rape laws in Albania. And in Kenya, a survey on women in agriculture that we supported led to the Agricultural Finance Corporation to revise its gender policy and make new commitments to address gaps in women's financing for agriculture. And in the Maldives, an assessment on the impact of COVID-19 that we conducted recently was used by the COVID-19 recovery team established by the Office of the Prime Minister as a basis for extending income support allowance to self-employed and informal workers. So in these particular examples, data, evidence, and politics, and I mean here, not versus, but and politics, did work together to produce great outcomes. Rather, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face, at least in my field, is the lack of data, timely gender-responsive data that can provide solid evidence to inform actions. We found that when the data exists, denial and inaction become less of an option. But if we take the SDGs as an example, the Sustainable Development Goals as an example, we only have 31% of the data that we need to monitor the gender-specific SDG indicators. 31%, that's less than a third. And without that data, then it isn't really evidence versus politics anymore, but I feel that it becomes opinions and politics. And this, in my opinion, is the biggest challenge. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Papa Ricardo. Can I put the floor to you and ask, I mean, you will be the co-chair of the, or the chair of the C20 process next year. So this topic, data and politics and evidence, what is your thinking on that?
Well, I think that Papa introduced the relevant point with his last words. That is that if we want to speak about this question, we have to welcome in the room the question about the truth. What is the truth? What is the reality? And we have an interpretation of the reality. We have visions. And those visions can be right or wrong, but who has the title to say what is right and what is wrong? I mean that we are walking in a very delicate field where there is a risk of ideological approach. There is a risk of mystification of reality. And so if we want to deal with this double how can I say, dialogue between evidence and politics, we have to think that the question is not so simple because it involves this different dimension, and in probably the space for a truth without questions and without diversity of opinion is relatively narrow. And that's the reason why it is absolutely very important to manage all the decisions that in a political process are to be taken, like the one in the path of the G20, but also like the ones in the path of the United Nations. Papa was speaking about the Agenda 2030 and all the data sets of indicators we use to understand if we are moving ahead enough or not. To take all these elements with very careful attitude that can, and trying to avoid the risk of mystification, ideology, etc. And the only way to do that probably is in participation. I mean, we need a dialogue among the decision makers, but a dialogue also including who are not in the room where the decision has to be taken. I'm speaking about the engagement groups in the dimension of the G20 that are the C20, the civil society group, the women 20, etc., etc., etc. And even more widely, if we are speaking about the perspective of multilateralism, that is our framework, because we think that the G20 has to be at the service of strengthening the multilateral dimension, the UN dimension. So thinking about that perspective, including as much as possible all the different actors that are active member of our society, with the capacity also to include the actors that has less opportunity to participate. In the following part of our panel, we can say something more, but I think that in this part, one strategical point is the issue of participation and the issue of creating the condition for participation. Let's just think about our panel. Someone who lives in a condition where there is no power, who has no internet, who has not an available and well-performing laptop, or can't manage English, how he or she can participate. So we have to land on these concrete issues.
Yes, thank you. Giving that perspective, we come back to that later, what we can do and what needs to be done. But I would like to give the floor to Sanchita, because she has a specific perspective on anti-corruption as well. So what is your statement? What is your thinking about the relation of evidence politics? And the floor is yours, Sanchita.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for the opportunity. And I would like to start by saying that I think my views are not very different from what Papa and Ricardo have said. But I would like to point out a few other things. And mostly, I think I'll be talking more on the anti-corruption bit, as you mentioned. I think when you talk about evidence in politics, it would be naive to think that it's either or. It's being driven by both. And where there is evidence, there are some agendas which are being pushed. And I think that's where there's this bias, I think, within the G20 process, where for certain things, the evidence is taken into account and it is thoroughly used to make decisions. And the outcomes have been, especially for economic policies and economic growth, where the G20 countries are fully committed. They have used the evidence thoroughly through the different policy-making, decision-making processes, not just during the G20 process, but outside of the G20 process, during the implementation, the monitoring and evaluations, where they have used the evidence to actually drive those agendas after the G20 summit itself. But there are other issues like anti-corruption, where I think a lot of the thinking and discussion within the G20 process prior to the summit or even during the summit is driven a lot by evidence. And we can see that from the fact that G20 has prioritized anti-corruption as one of the cross-cutting issues, that has to be taken into account if it wants to achieve its economic growth aspirations for equitable and economic growth. Having said that, the evidence is limited till the summit. After that, what happens? And we can see that within the G20 anti-corruption working group, how it works. There's the implementation process and also the monitoring and evaluation is not done thoroughly and with full commitment. Like the political will that exists to a certain extent, it sort of breaks down when it actually comes to. And if there is no implementation, if there is no proper monitoring and evaluation, and if that's the momentum, that's sort of you have that during the summit. If it's not delivered after the summit, it doesn't really make a difference. But I also want to point that, as I mentioned earlier, there are instances where evidence is slowly. I think there is also a difference between how politics sort of drives the agenda quicker. Whereas evidence, I think it's like a race. It's slowly, it will come and it will have an impact, but the process is very, 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 very slow. And again, I would like to give that example. I think it's a very positive thing that, at least for the anti-corruption working group, it has been identified as a priority issue. And for the first time in the G20 history, where there will be a first ministerial anti-corruption ministerial meeting that's happening later this year. Having said that, it took 10 years to get that whereas anti-corruption has always been identified as one of the priority issues. So I think it's both. I think there's and any decision making process, it involves a lot of stakeholders. There's a lot of interest groups. Everything is driving these, and I think that's just very obvious to everyone. I think G20, I think even for the civil society, recognizing that politics is not completely out. So we need to be aware. I think it's about being patient and the participation, what Ricardo mentioned as well, ensuring that civil society continue to use the spaces that are available to them to push for the agendas, the open government and open contract. And now, especially during COVID, there's a lot of talk about government procurements that are happening, which are just not abiding by any international standards. Government are just making random decisions, and those are going to have implications down the road. So a lot of the decisions, even within the G20 process, is made with very short-term thinking, whereas I think we need to start looking at the long-term impact these decisions are going to have, and that's where the evidence comes in, because I think there is lack of data, as Papa mentioned, but even where there is evidence and where there is data, we are not really paying much attention to it if it doesn't fulfill the political, the needs of of certain groups. So I think, yeah, I mean, that's where I think we need to focus on, especially on the civil society's role to continue to push for this agenda on evidence collecting, monitoring, as well as collecting data, providing citizen feedback, closing the feedback loop, basically. Civil society has a large role to play on that side, I think. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. And I really want to hand over to Ricardo, because he made an interesting point by saying, the data question is one thing, as Papa said as well. I mean, sometimes we don't have a lack of data, but there are ideology approaches which might prevent a good solutions. So, Ricardo, my question to you is, I mean, we had as analyzes, it's not either or, but what do you think can the C20 and other engagement groups or the general public do really to foster the data-based approaches within the G20? What is your thinking on that?
The temptation is to say that I don't know, because of course it's difficult. The easier answer is to increase the dimension of the dialogue, of the participation, as we were saying before, opening meetings, disclosing data, not only analytical data like the data sets, but also the reasons why, the rationale, the internal documents that should explain why a decision or an orientation is agreed among the group. But I think that we can identify two dimensions. One dimension is the, how can I say, the working one. I mean, the way to work. That is opening the meetings and the dialogue. We've already said, I don't repeat it. As Panchita said, we have definitely a better quality of dialogue in this moment than in the past in a lot of processes, both in United Nations as in the G20. But if we look at the G20, definitely there is anyway a lack of transparency. A lot of things are decided behind closed door. And so there is an issue of transparency that still exists within the process. But I think that there is a wider dimension that we should anyway approach that has to do with the risk of mystification. I would say two things. One, data. Data are not always the truth. There is an interpretation of the data. also of quantitative indicators. So a relevant issue is not only the way we are able to collect the data, and we put everybody in condition to have good statistical institutions, etc., etc., etc. But it also is also the narrative that is behind the data. I think that the issue of the narrative is fundamental. And here we find some mainstreams, even in the academic world, that sometimes are not questioning. Just take the data and the interpretation, the narrative as it is. And that's good. It's enough to free up the market, reducing the rules, and you will have growth and happiness for everybody. And maybe it's not precisely like that. But then there is a third dimension, that is the mystification. And I'm referring to all what we have seen in the recent years about campaigning, using social network, promoting, for instance, the populism all over the world, influencing electoral processes, all these actions that are existing, and they are strong, and often are even planned. It's not something that happens like that. All these issues have play an influence in the narratives and in the consensus and in the capacity of people to understand, to be part of the process, or to think that they are very happy in the process, while in fact they are victim of a mockery. And so again, who am I to say that there is a mockery? Who has the right to say where is the truth and where there is no truth and there is a mystification? And the only condition is to open up the spaces to dialogue, to speak together, try to make the evidence coming up with all those delicate issues. So to be a bit more concrete, I think that strategic element could be, for instance, action not only to open the spaces in the inner dimension of the G20, but to work on legislation, on the management of social network, of the web, of the net. We have rigorous laws on the managing of the freedom of expression on the media, on the official media, on the press. We are almost naked for the net. And the net is probably more influencing in this moment of the process. So there is a wide range of dimension that we should keep in mind, and that would need a legislative action to make the political decision really made on a real evidence-based process.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for that. I'm so thankful and grateful that you mentioned the question of narrative, and that is what I would like to hand over to Papa, because I think with the narratives we are facing the new problem that we have actors around the world in important institutions, be it presidents or prime ministers, really questioning data as such and saying, all right, of course, 99% of the entire world population know that there is a climate change, but we have actors, powerful ones, saying, no, I deny that. So, Papa, from my point of view, isn't that a question of trust? How can we rebuild trust in society? How can we rebuild trust in media and in institutions as well? So what is your impression about that? And I'm pretty sure that Sanchita will say something to that as well, because it might be linked to corruption as well. But I would like to give the floor to Papa first.
Yes, thanks very much, Marcus. And I'll just actually pick up right where Ricardo left off. And because we've all long known that data can be wrong, it can be biased, it can also be manipulated. And when it is wrong, when it is biased, or when we have manipulated data that are presented as fact, they should absolutely be questioned. So to me, that's not, the problem is not there. So, the wrong data should be questioned. No question there. I think where our challenge is actually knowing exactly when to question the data, and it shouldn't simply be because it doesn't fit our narrative. I think one of the problems that you mentioned, for instance, regarding denial of climate change and etc., is because it doesn't fit the narrative or the interests of specific people. So essentially, they do question it from that perspective. And here, again, and I think Ricardo is absolutely right that this is a complex issue. And the one thing that I think can help, and again, to be sure, this is not a panacea, but it is participation. It is openness as well, because once you have open dialogue with open data, and basically people can scrutinize the evidence, the data, and etc., are part of we're part of producing that data, if you will, and understand it. Then I think the issue of questioning is less relevant, or at least those who know the data and are trusted by the people can defend it. One of the problems that we have right now is basically, I think, that lack of participation. And just again, going back to examples, in our work with national statistical agencies, it's been a very difficult process to get them to really embrace participation from other groups, whether it is participation from civil society, participation from academia, and so on. It's been a challenge for them. But basically, where we've done it, we've seen really some spectacular results where these national statistical agencies have been able to rebuild trust in the information that they produce. And basically, and we've done this in just one area, gender, but it has also spilled over into other aspects. So again, I think, really promoting participation and openness is, I think, the cure that we have for this.
Yes, thank you very much. Sanchita, you want to add to that?
Sure. And again, I think transparency and openness is the key to building trust. I think no one would argue that. And in terms of that, I would like to focus more on, rather than just the data, it's like the role of civil society in actually bridging that gap. Because I think civil society can be, in a lot of places, represent the people's, the values of the people, the demands of the people. So I think they can play a very important role in bridging that gap, that trust gap. I think, and also we need to look at the different kinds of data that we talk about. There is a lot of technical data that comes out to inform higher level decision making. But sometimes especially when we talk about what's going on in social media, what's driving public, in public mood, or just public the thinking, it's completely different. They're not looking at the technical data, or they're not looking at a lot of the data generated at the high level. So I think, at least at the Accountability Lab, we work a lot with the people on the ground, collecting data from the people, evidence from the people, getting their insights on a lot of things, and trying to bridge the gap, the communication and the information gap that exists between the government and the people. And I think for the G20 process as well, a lot of this comes down to what is happening on the ground. So a lot of the decisions that are happening right now is a top-down approach. So we need to go back to, or it has to be more of a bottom-up approach. And I think that's where the participation of the civil society organizations, who are seen as neutral and independent, rather than coming with specific interests. Of course, there are specific issues we push for, like anti-corruption, climate change, gender. There are different sorts of issues, but in terms of our interests, it's the common good and collective good, rather than just trying to have a profit motive, or just looking at a certain group. So I think in terms of the narrative, I want to focus on the role of the civil society, mostly the local organizations that continue to bring that dialogue in the process. And the G20 process, I think, needs to focus on that.
Okay.
And provide the space for that dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You all of you made a very, very strong point and argument on participation might be the right way to rebuild trust and to really shape the process and make it better. I would like to ask you, Ricardo, if we include the entire civil society. I mean, I understand that this is really powerful to rebuild trust, but my question is, how can you find, and you yourself, you will have to decide the priorities for the C20 presidency next year. How can you manage to find priorities, and is that a contradiction of participation? I mean, hopefully not, but how you gonna manage this participation process?
Well, I can tell you what we did during these months while we were attending the process of the current, the incumbent, the ongoing C20 under the Saudi presidency, the civil society of Saudi Arabia presidency. In Italy, we gathered the different actors of Italian civil society, precisely asking everybody, what do you think should be the priorities? And we had a process of, I think, interesting and wide consultation, reaching a common consensus at the end, precisely identifying some priorities for next year. And we talk with the Italian government saying that in preparation of next year, we would like to focus on three main areas that are first, the framework. G20 has to be at the service of UN. G20 is not the world government. So we even don't want to deal too much with the G20 because we don't want to legitimate a process that, if left alone, is not what we would like for the world, because for the world we want a United Nations. Second, within this framework, you have a special responsibility given by your financial and economical strength. So please take initiative in putting at disposition for the world needs and the world emergency of COVID, etc., your financial opportunities, and have a strong initiative on debt cancellation. That for us, it will be the first priority, the most important priorities. Then, of course, a priority on strengthening and making robust public health systems. And third, again, an issue framework, all this in the framework of climate justice, of sustainability. But if we are very good in identifying some very nice sounding priorities, and of course we will start now the dialogue with the world civil society, because this is the thought of the Italian society. We have to ask ourselves also, what does it mean? I mean, what does having the consensus of civil society mean? Have we the capacity to involve the citizen, or we are just an elite? And I think that the same way we are questioning the governments and the international institutions, we have to question ourselves. Are we able to speak with the people and to gather from the people, Paji was saying, a bottom-up approach. In a bottom-up approach, what the people is thinking, their feelings, their thoughts, and elaborate it in the political dialogue, or we are just an elite of interesting people, the intellectual, able to very lucky because we all studied and we have opportunities, etc., etc., etc. I think that this point is always, and in that sense, I think that we have to think even out of the box about how to go beyond our capacity and capabilities, because even if we, I put in the middle of this panel at first the issue of participation and transparency, but in this participation is difficult. If we look about our capacity to involve people, I think that this is important. So we don't. So I finish. We don't just have to follow some technicalities used by who is trying to mystify, getting a very good consensus, speaking to the stomach of the people instead of the brain, as we are assisting in some social networks and so on. But we have to also think about how to go beyond and thinking out of the box. Sorry.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we come to the to an end for the first round, because we, of course, we want to welcome our participants and give them the option to ask questions. But I have one last question to all of you, and I really urge you and ask you to be very, very short. But that really interests me, and that is, and I would like to start with Papa. If you could address the head of states and governments directly during their G20 summit, what is your advice on what the G20 needs to do immediately? So please, not more than 90 seconds, better 60. Papa, would you like to try to start answering that question?
Yes, thanks very much. And definitely, if I was to address them, I would like to have more than 90 seconds. But what I would say is this. For me, it boils down to this. We've, at UN Women, have documented the far-reaching impacts of this pandemic on women. And what we've seen is that decades of progress on gender equality are at risk, even as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action. And unfortunately, countries aren't currently doing enough to address it, and civil society is stricken as a group and should be supported. So we've seen that an additional 47 million women will fall into poverty next year as a result of COVID-19, but only 10% of social protection and labor market measures taken by countries in response to COVID-19 are explicitly aimed at strengthening women's economic security. So we urge G20 governments to invest in women's immediate and long-term priorities, including protecting income security, jobs, and enterprises, expanding social protection and support for unpaid care and domestic work, swiftly addressing gender-based violence, ensuring women's active participation and leadership in the response to COVID-19, and finally, improving the collection and use of gender data. To me, these actions are absolutely critical, and if we are to build back better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. Your 90 seconds to the head of states and governments.
Well, I can use the C20 communique that we are releasing right now, and that will be given to the representative of the Saudi government on Saturday. That is articulated in 3 points. First, just policies for an inclusive recovery. Second, global solidarity for multilateralism. Third, address the climate and ecological crisis within this framework, and I invite everybody to read it. It's online as soon as it will be published. I think that if it's not online, it will be online very soon. There are some strategic points. One is debt cancellation again. One is health, strengthening of health public systems. But it's interesting, I think, two things more. One of this, with the debt cancellation, also a daring tax initiative, creating a tax conversion, an international tax commission at the UN level. This is absolutely strategical. And the other one is not only at the service of the world, but for the internal problem of G20 to invest, please, on respect of human rights and on respect of the rule of law. Because we have governments that are speaking about the problem of the world, and they are the first, I'm sorry to say that, in not respecting, really disrespecting human rights and the rule of law internally. And this is absolutely fundamental.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. Before I give the floor to the first question coming from Scotland, I would like to ask Sanchita, your 90 seconds in front of the head of state and government. What is your advice?
Just going quickly, I think putting corruption at the center of all the discussions is very important, because this is I think there's no denying that this is a cross-cutting issue that is going to impact no matter what policies, whether it be climate change, whether it be health, whether it be education, any sector. This is a challenge that G20 itself has identified is impairing its progress. And the second thing is, I think in terms of commitments, there have been enough commitments made, and I think it's about following up on those rather than making new commitments. And at the Accountability Lab, we have tried to track some of these commitments, and the narrative that we want to use to follow up on these commitments is not naming and shaming, but we want to identify best practices where there have been changes that have been made by countries. We want to highlight those and promote those so that others can follow as well. So I think it's more about it's focusing on what has worked and then trying to continue the good work rather than coming up with new commitments and just adding on to that list. And another is, I think, just having a learning mindset, basically, and then just learning from what has happened, mostly with what we talked about earlier, using evidence to drive the process, not just up to the summit, but afterwards as well. And especially for a lot of the groups that are outside of the finance track, I think that's a challenge. A lot of the agenda it sort of gets does not get a priority after post summit. There's just no momentum. And we've talked a lot about participation, but I think we need to make it more specific and say meaningful participation, because you can have the anti-corruption group or the civil society participate, but then if the recommendations are not being taken seriously, I think if it's just on a token basis, it doesn't matter. And so I think, again, participation, transparency, these should be the guiding principles for the G20 process.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I really would like to give the floor for the first question, and that is a question from Scotland, Hamish from Scotland. He says, I have a couple of comments about data and trust. Within the cost, infrastructure, transparency initiative, there is an important distinction between data and information. And the immediate challenge that arises is how to turn data into information in a manner that can be trusted by stakeholders. Under his approach, the approach of his institutions, this is achieved through a process that we call assurance, under which a group of people with the necessary range of competences is appointed by the multi-stakeholder group to turn disclosed data into compelling information. So obviously, that is, we all know that between data and information, there might be a tension. Ricardo, you mentioned that, and would you like to start answering and then Papa perhaps?
Yeah, well, 2 points. The first one in an introduction. The introduction is what I've already said. It's important, the narrative, the interpretation. And yes, of course, as much as we are able to provide sort of alliance among different actors, also to read the data and transform that in useful and credible information, the better will be the result. Okay, but then two small issues. I think that it's important not only to make to transform data and information, but it's also important to make that information available and understandable also by the public, and not only by the decision makers. That is that in fact the narrative is relevant, thinking about the citizens, and in that sense there are some care that we should have. That is that for instance, we need a strong investment in education. If we are working in a country where the education level is not high, it will be easier to say something that can be false or make mistakes even without having the will to do mistakes, even with no mystification, just mistakes. Those mistakes won't be seen, of course. So I think that an initiative to make the narrative adequate to the data and not mystified, it has to go with investment in improving the capability of citizens to participate, to read, to receive, and to understand information. This is one point. The second point is the use of specifically of indicators. I think that data, and when I'm saying data in this moment, I'm referring to indicators, statistical indicator. I think that Papa can be very, very sensitive on this point, of course. When we think about indicators, sometimes there is a sort of attitude from the people and even from decision makers sometimes to listen to the indicators as the indicators are the truth, are revealing the truth. But indicator has to be interpreted. I can give you an example. The Human Development Index has been created not to say who is developed or is not developed, but to say what are the countries who have more opportunity to make the exercise of the development, that is choosing our own future and work to realize it. But then a lot of people read the high part of the rank of the HDI saying, oh, these are the developed and the other are the development. But developing doesn't mean anything in the language of human development. So even good indicators, if are not well taken and used, can even, without having the intention, mystify the picture. And so instead of saying to the government, you have to talk with your citizen and choose what you want to. And this indicator only says if you have more or less possibility to do that, but to work to enhance and to increasing your opportunity to that. The result is that we have to be better performing in that indicator. So let's invest on the sector that are measured by the indicator. So the indicator, instead of follow a situation, will precede and becomes the agenda, the political agenda. There is absolutely something that has no meaning, even if it's no will. So this element of the good use of the indicator exactly as the element of education to make citizens able to understand and to participate in a proper way, I think are relevant.
Yes, thank you. I would like to give the next question to Papa, because there are more questions, and I really would like to open the floor to these questions. And the question is, how should the G20 frame commitments in a way that ensure that they can be held accountable for those commitments? A very important point. You all mentioned that implementation aspect. Papa, could you please answer that from your point of view?
Sorry, I guess that's the difficult question, right? How can the G20 frame commitments in a way that ensures that they can be held accountable for those commitments? I think one of the first things is motivation, right? You can frame commitment in any way, but you have to want to be held accountable to those commitments, right? So essentially, I mean, if you want to be held accountable to those commitments, then basically I think you frame them in a way that says, I am going to achieve X by Y, right? So even if it is small commitments, whatever they are, basically I think those commitments have to be measurable, have to be quantifiable, and the groups also have to be empowered to hold you accountable to those commitments. And, for instance, I mean, just an example, if we take the Sustainable Development Goals, and here countries essentially have established targets, and those targets are, basically we will achieve X by Y. But one of the challenges is that those targets are not necessarily always translated to country level targets that they can be held accountable to. So generally, I think we have a global framework, which is great. And a lot of countries have actually translated them into national policy priorities and targets. And so that's great. And those countries essentially are setting at least the, putting the first step forward to be held accountable to those commitments. But just coming back to, the previous question a little bit, one thing that I wanted to add to what Ricardo has said is that I actually think that data is really critical. It's not meaningless. It's really important because how you collect the data and what you collect essentially gives you a sense of what kind of information you can extract from it. If your data is biased, your conclusions will be biased, right? And so I think we should definitely, so the approach that I think the person who asked the question of inclusiveness in the analysis is important, but you also have to have inclusiveness in how the data is collected and what data is collected, because that's as important.
Yes, thank you very much. We have a comment from Kamil Salamah from Saudi Arabia, and he's saying, and that's very true, comprehensive data is commonly difficult in many countries due to lack of adequate resources and capacities. You all mentioned that as well. And that brings me to the point, Sanchita, perhaps you would like to answer that. How can we involve the most vulnerable groups in the decision-making process? Obviously, that within the G20, people who are mostly affected by, for example, climate change or corruption or poverty are not included in the process. And Ricardo and Papa were proposing and thinking how to make sure that we ourselves are not elites just saying we speak for the people, but how can we safeguard that the most vulnerable people affected by tragedies and crises are involved in decision-making process, and how can we make sure that comprehensive data is provided around the world?
Thank you, and I meant to appreciate Ricardo for being very honest about us being elites, and just having that opportunity to actually make these comments, but do they actually represent what is happening on the ground? And I'm originally from Nepal, so I have seen, like, on the ground what actually the very diverging, and I think it's not just for developing country, but even for developed countries. It is true that there's a big gap between what priorities are being set at the at the top level versus what citizens actually demand. And again, I think I cannot stress enough the role of civil society organizations that are working on the ground. And again, we are one of them, but I think this is also a time where there's a lot of engagement from the people. And I'm sure, like, the civil society members can vet for this, that everybody is working from within their limits and their resources to try and make governments accountable, to try and bridge those gaps. And at Accountability Lab, we have these campaigns, we have these programs where we try and connect some of these vulnerable groups with the policy agenda, try to inform those policy agendas. And I think that is the best way, because it's a very tough question. And although as elites, I think we're sitting here proposing so some of the ideas that we propose are good to talk about, or are in ideal sense, that's how it should be done. But in practice, they can often be difficult for the obvious reasons that have already been identified. Mostly in most of the places, it is because of lack of resources. But some of these things don't even require a lot of resources, at the ground level. Like I'll give you an example what Accountability Lab did. And this, I was back home in Nepal after the earthquake, and they have set up help desk in communities, trying to ask people what they need, how they were affected by the earthquake. And there were resources coming into the country from large donors, and they were helping bridge that gap, making people aware that these resources are available. So I think some of these initiatives don't always require a lot of resources. I think it's more about the motivation, and civil society organizations have the motivation to actually bridge those gaps. And what I would like to tell the G20, and I guess just governments in general, is that you need to view civil society as partners. They're not threats. We are there to monitor and evaluate and feedback into your decision, feedback information into the decision making process. And we're not trying to compete to provide services. I think a lot of times there's that tussle that sort of happens. And but you can see examples from countries where civil societies have worked to create conditions where the government has actually benefited, and people have within the communities have benefited because they have been able to create that trust within the community. So I think it's the lack of resources is there, but there's still a lot of things we can do through dialogues, through participation to bridge those gaps.
Thank you. And I have the next question is directly linked to what you just said, and I would like to put that to Ricardo. I mean, there's the question if it would be powerfuler if all engagement groups, so the Civil 20, the Business 20, the Women 20, Youth 20, Urban 20, Think Tank 20, would have a sort of common statements on really what is the opinion of the civil society, because obviously think tanks, urban level and business and women, youth is civil society as well. So Ricardo, you are thinking in that direction for next year, really putting these engagement groups together, or is it just watering down the recommendations?
No, I was saying that, I think that a dialogue among engagement groups is important, of course. As much as we are able to provide a consensus and stronger is the political demand that is coming from that consensus, of course. The point is that what Sanjita was saying is fundamental. And I am not sure that from all the engagement group, there is this capacity or even this will to work in that perspective. I mean, it is perfectly legitimate to politics is also a sort of a balanced and even sometimes a conflict, better dialogue than conflict, but conflict of interest. And then it's okay, democracy is a competition also among interests, nothing against that. But my concern, not my concern, our concern is to be able to take on board the most vulnerable. And I'm not so sure that this is the main concern of all the engagement groups. So the point is not only to be able to make everybody able to converge on a common element, but to make everybody have a say. And in that sense, we have some tools. There are experience, precisely in the field of anti-corruption, for instance. I had the opportunity to see fantastic, even to cooperate in that, but it was not my merit, so I can speak very easily about that, of interesting opportunities of participation in Latin America, for instance, through, for example, the experience of vedurias. That is, citizens that are called and put in condition to have all the information related to the management of a public institution and have an evaluation of what was happening, helped by expertise, by people with good technical knowledge at disposition to help in understanding the process, but leaving the final voice of those evaluation to the group of citizens with an open process to participate. Other issues, pollution in the Andes. Some projects have been funded to create a sort of civil society monitoring, or citizen, better said, citizen monitoring of the quality of pollution of the water and of the air, to provide independent data to be compared to the official data provided by the companies owning the mines, etc. And creating also opportunity for public discussion on this. So where we did this, it happened to have a fantastic law, or better law, on pollution, with a consensus, with even the business sector committed in doing something that could get them also the consensus of the population. It is difficult, it's not so easy, but I think that this element has to be maintained. So it's not just a consensus or a dialogue among groups of interest, of engagement group, but it is the capacity to put to call in the room everybody, starting from who normally remain out of the room.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have the next question from Agnes from Poland. And this question is on gender, and I would like to put that to Papa. Agnes is asking that the G20 itself are not diverse enough, especially when it comes to gender. We all know that there are not many head of states and governments, and the same is true when we focus on the engagement group, that you have a sort of male-dominated discussion. To be honest, in our discussion, there are 3 male and only 1 female. So, Papa, what is your recommendation? Do we need quotas within the G20, within the engagement groups, or what is your experience from United Nations to tackle that problem?
Yeah, so at the government level, basically, we know that quotas work. But if we're just talking about the head of state level, I think we've also seen that in the recent General Assembly, where only men are speaking. We know that globally, for instance, 75% of legislators are male. So, and where countries have instituted quotas, that has definitely made a big difference in terms of women's representation. And again, I think the G20 unfortunately will not be diverse enough unless we achieve diversity based on gender, but diversity also based on other factors. So basically, women's intersecting identities. So different identities that need to be represented in order, whether we're talking about civil society or we're talking about governments, representation is absolutely key. And so some of the work that, for instance, we've been doing that, particularly on intersectionality, I would say, is really trying to bring diverse groups that represent diverse interests. Some of them are, women-led groups, women's groups, but others are men-led groups as well. And really having a conversation on what is important to measure, at least when we are talking about different identities. And there, once you have that, then I think, it really starts to address the question of, who's elite and who's not, because you do have diverse voices that are representative, diverse interests. And essentially, in the end, not everybody will win, will have exactly what they want, but people will also find common ground in the way they are doing things. And sorry, just one final example is, for instance, UN Women was supposed to organize this year the Generation Equality Forum. which is a civil society-led initiative to really have some bold actions on to achieve gender equality and women's empowerment. And essentially, what we ended up doing was really the unthinkable, which is bring different groups, particularly civil society, around the room to agree on what is important. We ended up with 6 themes: gender-based violence, economic justice and rights, bodily economy and autonomy, and sexual and reproductive health and rights, feminist action for climate justice, technology and innovation for gender equality, and feminist movements and leadership. Obviously, leaving out a lot of issues that people care about, but in the end, this was a common ground, something that we all agreed to, and basically providing a really huge platform to all advocate for the same things. So I think, again, it's not a zero-sum game, in my opinion, as long as you have meaningful participation.
Yes, thank you very much. And I would give the same questions to Sanchita and to Ricardo as well as last speaker. Then, how can we achieve diversity within the institutions as well as within the engagement groups to really make sure? And that is something you are discussing the whole time, saying, of course, there is a relation of data and narratives, and therefore we really have to have the right framework and a good participation and to safeguard that. Yeah, Sanchita, what is your perspective on that?
So in terms of making it more diverse and inclusive, I think it has to be a conscious effort. It recognizing that there is that gap and then making conscious effort to actually remove those gaps. And I think it starts with changes at the very organizational level. Everybody, I mean, even today's panel, I think it was a conscious decision to include a female and get a different voice. So I think for every event, for every discussion that happens, just making sure, and not just women, like Papa said, there are different people from different backgrounds whose voices are not represented. Forget at the local level, I mean, forget at the global level, but even at the very local level, they are. So I think there have been efforts within governments, within institutions to recognize this gap, and there are efforts being made. But I think also, and I think this might be more like moving towards just a general topic rather than anti-corruption. For me, as being a woman as well, and coming from a different background, is giving the opportunities, mostly I think focusing on educational opportunities, because you don't want to have people represented or just because they are from a different group. You want to provide the right capacity so that they have the right information, so that when they are engaging, they are actually aware of the issues. And there, at least back home in Nepal, there were a lot of instances where they were trying to be representative. So you had these mostly in the parliament and different political groups, and you had these people just being put there, but they didn't really know the issues, or they were not given that, they were not capacitated enough to actually have a meaningful dialogue. So I think there has to be more focus on building that capacity, providing the similar opportunities. And I think, again, this goes back to the whole SDGs and making sure that everybody has certain basic capacity and rights, and especially in terms of health, education, and then they are able to come and actually voice their opinions, because otherwise just having diversity for the sake of it is not going to be effective or meaningful. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would the last question I would put to Ricardo, because we all know that Ricardo is in charge to organize the process for next year. And of course, the question of diversity, the question of gender is already discussed. But I would like when we look at the Agenda 2030, I mean, one could ask how to include development countries and all the groups I just mentioned who will be or who are affected mostly from G20 decisions. So, Ricardo, what is your thinking of how to safeguard diversity in gender terms and other terms?
I absolutely share what has been said right now. And I think that we have to never stop questioning ourselves, as I was saying before, because we could say that civil society, for instance, shows maybe a better picture than other sector of the society or public institution or whatever, having more women involved or whatever. But anyway, there's a lot to do still, and so I think that we can put in place some little technical attention, like for instance to have always, when we will name the leader of the working groups of the C20, to pay attention to have always one man and one woman, for instance, and as well as involving, balancing a presence among the leader of the international working, thematic working groups, also of people from the global south and from all regions. And this is an attention that we have to pay, and sometimes is a little bit forgotten, as Sanjita was saying before. And I'm feeling also very embarrassed in saying that, because what we see even in the international civil society is that sometimes it is a little bit, let's say, dominated by white men, English speaking, coming from the north. I'm from Italy, I'm from Europe, so I am one of the category that practically is a little bit monopolizing or historically monopolized our position, and it's not fair. And sometimes we forget it even, because you think that you are committed and working for the good, and so you won't do anything wrong ever. But anyway, so there are small attention like that are useful to show a coherence. On the other hand, I think that anyway, if there is no action on the educational dimension, as Sanjita was saying, as that we said a lot of times this afternoon, any attention will be not so productive. And there is an element that is the institutional support. We are speaking with the Italian government, and we are asking the Italian government to start not only as Italy, but within the dimension of the G20, if we are speaking, or when we are speaking about the G20, about institutional support to facilitate the participation. Because speaking about engagement groups, we have engagement groups like, of course, the B20, the Business 20, that has absolutely no problem in providing a participation from their constituency. They are profit-based organizations, and civil society is not producing profit. So if the government don't see that there is an interest, a common interest in having civil society on board, providing the voice of citizens and starting from the most vulnerable, because this is the only way to create a framework that can go near the common good. So if the government don't see that and don't share opportunities to that, that means, practically speaking, resources. This kind of participation will be difficult, and will be theoretical, and of course probably will involve only the elite who can have with a different resource, can pay from different resources the mean for that opportunity. We are working on that. We are calling strongly on that. We are not receiving strong answers, frankly speaking, right now, because not all the governments, and I'm not only speaking about Italy, of course, are so willing to widen the participation. And we go back to the call I was making before on human rights and the rule of law.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Participation, education, the strengthening of engagement group with a view on the most vulnerable groups. These are some of the recommendations from that very insightful panel. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, the C20 and the Secretariat, to make that possible. The C20 Secretariat has collected all inputs in the session from speakers and the audience. There will be an evaluation of all contributions, discussions, and proposals in working groups. And finally, Ricardo, you mentioned that C20 communique, which will be handed over to the G20 leaders. You can follow further C20 activities and also other G20 related engagement groups online. I would like to thank the Saudi presidency, and I'm looking forward to next year when Ricardo is heading the C20 during the Italian presidency. All of you are invited to follow the Global Solutions Initiative as well. We are serving for all engagement groups and for the G20 as well. So thank you very much again. It was my pleasure, and I'm grateful for that really fruitful and insightful discussion. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you to you, Marcus.
Thank you.